Enjoyable as this might be, Hufflepuff called into the roaring wind, I think it is rather spooking the reindeer.
What is to be spooked about? Gryffindor replied, grinning as he held grimly onto the reins.
Well, for starters, Ravenclaw suggested helpfully, I think they are rather used to having their hooves on the ground.
Gryffindor shrugged. Nonsense! They're mice, after all, as Salazar has pointed out, and as such they haven't the brains for self-doubt. They're fine, and will be there in no time at all. Far be it for me to mention it, Slytherin declared, peering over the side of the sledge, but I do believe we have just passed well over the roof of the cottage in question. Oh, Gryffindor replied, tugging the reins again. Ah, never you fear. We'll land in the back of the cottage, thus hiding our presence from the young Lady Gabriella. The perfect plan, I dare say. Wind howled around the sledge as Gryffindor piloted it through the air. The reindeer galloped gamely along, their hooves whistling through the frigid night sky. As they lowered, they wove through tall pines, approaching the moonlit roof of the cottage. A thin trail of smoke streamed from the crooked chimney. Next to it, just as indicated, a broken wrought iron vane leaned. With a thump and a jounce, the sledge landed in the tiny garden and slid to a sudden halt. Quickly now, Ravenclaw said, breathing hard. Let us dispatch the wolf. Surely we will be doing the foul creature a favor. Wait, Rowena, Hufflepuff said, touching her sister witch on the shoulder. We cannot all go barreling into the cottage. Remember the details of our mission. We must not be seen. Stealth and cunning must be our watchword. Surely a mere muggle werewolf does not require the attention of all four of us. There was a moment's thought, and then all eyes turned to Salazar Slytherin. Stealth and cunning, Gryffindor said, his eyes sparkling in the moonlight, do seem to be your specialty, Salazar. Slytherin rolled his eyes. All right, I'll do it, he proclaimed lazily, but I refuse to enjoy it. Let the record show it. Slowly, regally, Slytherin rose to his feet, standing in the rear of the sledge. He smoothed his thick robes, adjusted his collar and hood. And then, with a sudden rush of air, he transformed. Artifacts had heard about such things, but had never actually seen it happen. He gasped and clutched his scrolls to his chest. Slytherin squeaked in the night air and swooped up from the sledge, his leathery wings beating steadily. It certainly isn't very pretty, Ravenclaw commented, her mouth turned down in mild disgust. But I suppose being a bat does come in handy sometimes. The bat bobbed through the air, barely visible in the moonlight. When it reached the house, it clambered up the stone wall, disappearing under the eaves. Several long moments of tense silence ticked past. In the sledge, Hufflepuff turned and looked back at Merlin, one eyebrow raised. How did you really know about this mission tonight, Merlinus? She asked. Just as I told you, he replied evenly. The king sent me. Hufflepuff sighed. A moment later, there was an explosion of noise inside the house. There was a muffled howl, a wild scuffling, and then a horrible guttural retching sound. 5 seconds later, the rear of the house burst open, shattering it into bits, and a large, vaguely humanoid wolf tumbled out onto the snow, as if propelled by some unusual force. It scrambled to get its feet beneath it, and then bolted off through the garden, mewling to itself and never looking back. In the sledge, all eyes stared at the wood into which the wolf had vanished. Am I mistaken? Ravenclaw said mildly. Or was that werewolf wearing women's underclothes? I believe it was actually a nightdress, Gryffindor corrected, and a bonnet. I'm fairly certain it was wearing a bonnet. Hufflepuff turned back to Merlin once more, her eyebrow raised sardonically. We are to understand, she said wryly, that the werewolf was dressed as the young girl's grandmother? Merlin shrugged very slowly, his shoulders moving like tectonic plates. I told you it was a very clever werewolf. Across the yard, a shadow moved. Slytherin stepped out of the house and strode casually through the snow, his wand at his side.
After a dozen paces, he stopped, as if remembering something. Raising his wand, he half turned back to the broken door. "Reparo," he said idly. The pieces of the door sprang back together and socketed into the gaping frame. "Nicely done, Salazar," Hufflepuff commented as the bald wizard resumed his seat. "I hesitate to ask, but what has become of the young girl's grandmother?" "Ah, that," Slytherin replied, straightening his collar again. "She shall be fine. Rather amazingly, the wolf had swallowed her whole. I simply induced it to, produce her again. A slight memory modification has convinced her she has been asleep the entire night." "Pardon me for saying so, Salazar," Merlin said as Gryffindor snapped the reins once more. "But I do believe it looks like you enjoyed yourself after all." "Well, will Christmas wonders never cease?" Slytherin muttered, not meeting Merlin's gaze. Silently, the sledge streaked through the woods, retracing its path back to the castle.